You know what time it is. It's story time. Mixing up some lamb milk for a bucket. We have a 5-nipple bucket right here. And this is our do-it-yourself hack. These are just regular nipples that you get off of a baby bottle at Kroger. And they work. They're not perfect. They're not as good as the red rubbers, but they work pretty good. While I was mixing up some milk here, I thought maybe I would tell you about Orina Culver. Now, Orina was Mike Culver's grandmother, and she lived in the old house. It was her land. Mike bought that, and his practice and his home is there now. But way back in the 80s, when I worked for Dr. Mike Culver, he had one rule. And that rule on the farm was, whatever Orina said, I had to do it. It didn't matter what I was doing. If she called for me, I was to stop whatever I was doing. It didn't matter if I was in the middle of hay, if I was in the middle of delivering a calf, if I was cutting grass or weed eating. It didn't matter. I had to go do whatever Orina told me to do. Well, I liked Orina. She was way up in her 80s. I got to be a pallbearer at her funeral. She's way up in her 80s, and I liked her so much. She was just a lot of fun to be around, and she suffered from macular degeneration. So she had this on her table. She had this giant magnifying glass with lights around it, and she would sit at her table and read the newspaper every day through that magnifying glass and that light. And I would visit with her from time to time. Well, I got the inclination about June, when all of the blackberries were ripe, that I would go pick her a gallon of blackberries while I was picking. And I did. I went around her farm, and on a late Saturday afternoon, after everything was done, work was done, and I picked blackberries right up until dark. And right before she went to bed, I went over to her house, and she let me in, and I gave her that gallon of blackberries from her farm. Oh, it just tickled her to death. I mean, she was beside herself that I had picked those blackberries for her. You talk about feeling good about myself, okay? But there is a good old-fashioned saying that no good deed goes unpunished. Did I tell you that Orina suffered from macular degeneration? That she had to read from a big giant magnifying glass? Did I tell you that part? Because that's really important. Because see, Monday when I was out cutting grass, I had to cut around her house. And she come out flagging me down. She had a hanky and she had her apron on for she'd been cooking in her kitchen. She flagged me down and asked me to come on in. And so I, doing what the boss told me to do, I went over to Orina's house, and she told me to come in and sit down at the table. She had something for me. A big heaping bowl of Blackberry Cobbler with a big scoop of vanilla ice cream on it. And it was a steaming hot, and it was coming off of there. And I tell you what, on that hot summer day, that was paradise to my eyeballs. And I was excited. She'd made me a Blackberry Cobbler, and she was so happy to get me to come in and eat that Blackberry Cobbler with her. Poor old Orina had not distinguished between the salt and the sugar. And I took a big old honking bite of that, and after about 3 or 4 chomps, there was something wrong with that Blackberry Cobbler. It's like I'd stuck a salt block in my mouth. It's like I'd said a cuss word around Susan and she decided to wash my mouth out with soap. It was terrible. And she was just beaming about how that she'd made this cobbler for me, and I needed to get some cobbler. I couldn't bear it. I could not tell her. And as a 18 or 19-year-old young man, I ate every stinking spoonful. And I licked that bowl clean. The whole time, I was dying. I mean, I was dying. Well, she come over and got the bowl. She said, "Boy, you sure are hungry." And she went over to the stove and got me another bowl full and set it down in front of me. And I was already nauseated. I mean, I was sweating at the withers from all that salt. And I was trying to drink some water, and she'd put some milk down on top of that. I got about halfway through the next bowl, and I said, "Orina, I just don't think I can eat anymore on this hot day." And she says, "Boy, you've eaten a lot. You've eaten a lot." I said, "It's the best black cobbler." About that time, Dr. Cobbler come through the door. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, Orina's made me some Blackberry Cobbler." She said, "You get in here, Mike, and you have some of this Blackberry Cobbler." You remember where I told you she had macular degeneration? I was going, no. And he was looking at me kind of cockeyed, and I got up from the table and said, "Orina, I got to go back to work. Boss is here." And she said, "All right, honey, I thank you so much for getting them blackberries for me." I went over to Mike and I put my hand on his shoulder. I said, "Do not eat the cobbler. She got the salt and the sugar mixed up." And I walked out the door. I ran out the door. And I found the nearest fence post, and everything from 1984 came up. I mean, I was on my knees puking that stuff up. It was bad. I mean, I had marginal salt poisoning from eating. I went over to the water trough, and I was drinking water like cattle trying to dilute that stuff. I paid a price for eating that cobbler, because not only did that make me throw up, but just like going in for a colonoscopy, I had all that salt in my body, and I was hot, and now I was drinking all this water. By the time I got home, it cleaned everything out. It truly is. I think back on it now, eating all that salt, it truly is a miracle that I didn't get sicker than I did. Mike Culver come over, and he told me later, he said, "I did have to have a bite of that cobbler, and it was terrible." And I said, "Well, what'd you do? How'd you handle it?" I told Orina that was the best cobbler I'd ever eaten in my life. I said, "You liar." He said, "Well," and I told her that my family would so love to have some, because he had a family full of kids. And she says, "Well, Mike, if you want to take it home to your kids, that would be fine." So he went and put aluminum foil on it and gave her a big hug and kiss and gathered that cobbler up and took it out of there. And she never knew the difference. 2 or 3 days later, I'm out there cutting grass on the riding lawnmower. She flags me down. She says, "I made you another cobbler. You need to come over here." I got off of that lawnmower and I made my way over to it, and I was already sweating just thinking about. I went in and sat down, and there was a bowl of brand new steaming Blackberry Cobbler with ice cream on it. I took my first bite with my eyes closed, and to my grand relief, she hadn't mixed up the salt and sugar this time. It was actually really good, and I had 3 bowlfuls. What we do sometimes, but I thought you might enjoy that story about Blackberry Cobbler.